Well, thank you, Jack. Can everyone hear me? Well, it's good to be back. In 1948, the National Academy of Sciences held its annual meeting in Berkeley, California. I was scheduled at that meeting to give a talk on possibilities for supersonic transport. Three other fellows were there on the speaking program. Shockley, Bardeen, Brattain, three young fellows from Bell Labs. I spoke on the supersonic transport. I thought that my theory of the swept wing with subsonic edges, perhaps the delta wing, could result in a viable supersonic transport. Shockley, Bardeen, and Brattain spoke on, they disclosed for the first time their invention of the transistor. Well, the transistor has changed the world, but the supersonic transport has not. Now, it took a great deal of courage for the British and the French to build an SST, a supersonic transport. But unfortunately, it hasn't really worked out economically. I know that because I've never been supersonic myself. I can't afford to ride on the Concorde. I feel a little bit like Charlie Zimmerman. Many of you remember Charlie Zimmerman. He worked at Langley when I was there, and he was in charge of the spin tunnel. At that time, in the early 30s, the Army Air Corps had a problem with spinning. They'd lost a number of airplanes in the spin, so they sent a general to Langley Field to find out what progress we were making on the spin problem. Well, Dr. Lewis accompanied the general to Langley Field. He took him to Charlie Zimmerman. He introduced Zimmerman to the general as the world's foremost authority on the spin. The general looked at Charlie Zimmerman and said, "Ever been in a spin?" Well, Charlie blushed from head to toe, I'm sure, because he had never been. I feel a little bit like Charlie Zimmerman. Here I am pretending to be a world authority on supersonic flight, and yet I've never been supersonic. So, well, I think we have to admit that the laws of aerodynamics are distinctly favorable to flight in the subsonic speed range. A Boeing 747 flying in the thin air at 40,000 feet can get about the same gas mileage as an automobile, the same miles per gallon per passenger, about 60, and yet it's going 10 times as fast. The subsonic airplane really has changed the world. You can hardly find anyone these days who hasn't been to Europe at least once, but subsonically. On the other hand, if you could develop an airplane that would make the trip in half the time, then an operator would need only half as many airplanes, eh? Now, a 747 costs about $140 million. So if the operator can reduce the number of airplanes he needs for a given service to half, then he might be willing to pay a little more for gas. Eh? Unfortunately, the Concorde simply can't make the economic gain that is necessary. A Concorde passenger has to buy, each passenger has to buy 2,000 pounds of fuel. Okay? Worse than that, he has to pay airfare on it at first-class rates. Okay? The fuel required by the Concorde is about 10 times the passenger load, you see. And perhaps the worst is that the Concorde uses 40% of its fuel in subsonic maneuvering. Crossing the Atlantic at an L/D of about 7 or 7.5, when it slows down to subsonic speed, the L/D drops to about 4. Right? Now, the low speed lift drag ratio is so low that it needs an afterburner for takeoff. Now, these problems can be solved if we can develop an all-wing supersonic transport, okay, that can vary its sweep angle in flight by steering with rudders. Okay? First, let's go a little bit into the theory by which we arrive at the oblique wing as an optimum for supersonic speed. If this cord is long enough, oh, here's the blackboard. I'd like to put down a formula for a lower bound for the drag at supersonic speed. This is friction coefficient, skin friction coefficient, times the wetted area of the airplane, times Q, the dynamic pressure, rho half V squared. L is the lift. This constant is easy to remember because it's the octave below middle C. No, the Q is not there. It's up here. Now, at subsonic speeds, only these terms are operating. So, to get the minimum drag at subsonic speeds, we want the smallest wetted area, and of course the smallest skin friction coefficient, and we want the maximum span in the direction perpendicular to the flight direction. And we come to the proportions of a sailplane. Okay? Long, narrow wing, small wetted area, large span. At supersonic speed, you have, first of all, the drag due to lift, which increases with the square of the Mach number, and which is inversely proportional to a length which you determine by cuts made by Mach planes, but which is proportional to the length in the flight direction. Okay? Drag due to lift. There is another term, drag due to volume. And that, again, is inversely proportional, in this case, to the fourth power of the length in the flight direction. So, in order to achieve the minimum drag at supersonic speeds, you need to have a wing which has the smallest wetted area, the greatest span in the flight direction, and at the same time, the greatest length in the flight direction. Okay? what configuration satisfies those conditions? Okay. Well, clearly, a long, narrow, oblique lifting line and a line that contains the volume of the airplane. Okay. Now, that, of course, moreover, the lifting line should be elliptically loaded, just as in subsonic speed for minimum drag. Now, if I draw any two streamlines and any two Mach lines, that lifting line and volume line will yield the smallest drag for any distribution of lift or volume within this area. Okay? Now, of course, the lifting line's impractical. If I change the constraint area just a little, make this an ellipse, okay? Cutting off the corners here, then I arrive at the optimum wing shape for supersonic speeds. It's just the same as the optimum wing shape for subsonic speeds, okay? Except it's turned at an angle. Now you say, well, why don't I cut it in the middle and bend it back like that, eh? It's prettier that way. Makes a better radiator ornament, okay? But what happens to that turn? See, I've cut the length in half. The 2 to the 4th power is 16, so it has at least 10 times the wave drag due to volume. Well, all right. Let's keep the length in the flight direction, divide it into 2 panels, eh? Making each panel half as wide. Then I have the same wetted area, same length and everything. But then, you see, the wing panels have to survive structurally with half the width and half the thickness. Okay? So, it seems clear to me that the optimum wing shape for supersonic speed is the same as the optimum wing for subsonic speed. Namely, a long, narrow, high aspect ratio wing turned at an oblique angle to the flow. Now, I've said this numerous occasions before. No one seems to make any counter-arguments. Now, we have a room full of expert aerodynamicists here. Will someone give me a counter-argument? No? So it must be so. Well, I have some view graphs I'd like to show. I have the, let's see, I'm told that if I push this, no.
Up on the top.
Up here. There is an airplane, an oblique winged airplane, the AD-1, flying over the Mojave Desert in California. And the wing is turned in this picture about 45 degrees. Okay? Quite a number of pilots have flown that. It had no automatic controls or anything, just cables connecting the stick to the ailerons in the elevator. The pilots found it not too pleasant to fly with the wing at 60 degrees, but they flew it. They landed it with the wing at 45 degrees. Okay? At Oshkosh, flew over the clouds every day for a week with the wing at 60 degrees. Now, if you took the fuselage off, you would eliminate the pivot, right? First of all. Second of all, you'd improve the lift-drag ratio. Okay? You'd have a flying wing. But if it's going to be a transport, people have to stand up in it, then it has to be very large. Evidently at least 400 feet long. Let's have the next slide. At Ames Research Center, we tested a model of the oblique wing with a small fuselage, as you see there, 10-to-1 ellipse, 10% thick. Everything was in our favor. This next slide shows the lift-drag ratios we got. Okay? At zero sweep, this wing-body combination had a lift-drag ratio better than 30-to-1. And as the speed increased, Mach number 1 and 45 degrees, we got an L over D of 20. And the tunnel only went up to 1.4. We got an L over D of about 11. And the next. Then we tried, maybe we could push that down a little. We tried different airfoil sections. First, airfoil number 1 was a NACA 4-digit section. Number 2 was one of Whitcomb's supercritical airfoils. You see the supercritical airfoil really did its thing when the wing was straight. It maintained an L over D of 30 out to a Mach number of 8/10. Right? However, when the wing was swept 60 degrees, it didn't perform as well as the one with a very high camber, number 3. So I'll have to ask Dick Whitcomb to design me an airfoil that will work with 60 or 70 degrees of sweep. It will have to have a design lift coefficient of 1 or 1.5 preferably, and a Mach number 0.6, 0.65. Okay? Now, this is an analysis of those tests. One of the things that worries people about sweep with subsonic leading edges is that you may not get the leading edge thrust. Okay? The lift-drag ratio depends critically on that. Well, this shows that you do up to a certain small lift coefficient. At about 2/10, it breaks away, flow separates from the leading edge, and you lose the leading edge thrust. But 1/10 to 2/10 is good enough for cruise. Okay? Well, this shows my estimate of the lift-drag ratios that you can get with oblique elliptic wings plotted against Mach number. And you see the L over D improves rather dramatically as you increase the aspect ratio of the wing. 10-to-1 axis ratio will get you almost 15 at Mach 2. Okay? Okay. Now, if people are going to ride in this, as I said earlier, the flying wing has to be very large. And I say the root chord at least 50 feet at 8-to-1 means that the span has got to be 400 feet. Okay? So you say, well, good heavens, we can't build an airplane that big. But we did build the Akron and other big airships that were twice that large. Okay? Moreover, the load on the flying wing is distributed along the span. You don't get any strong bending moments. Okay? There is another thing. We now have reliable means for automatic stability. The airplane doesn't have to be inherently stable. So the older flying wings, like the Northrup and the pterodactyl in England in the 20s, the center of gravity had to be at about 20% of the chord, way forward. so that most of the volume of the wing was unusable. See? But if we can put narrow trailing edge flaps all along and actuated by a computer to provide stability, then we can move the center of gravity back to about 40% of the chord, well, 35 anyway, closer to the center of volume. That makes the flying wing much more practical. Well, this shows a sketch of an arrangement. 300 passengers, 400-foot span, fuel in the outboard sections. I have 2 arrows there at Mach 1. Anything below Mach 1 or below, it would fly at 45 degrees. Now, the pilots landed the AD-1 with the wing at 45 degrees. If you can land this wing that way, then you may not need to swivel the engines. Okay? All you need to do is redirect the thrust by about 25 degrees. So then, the only variable geometry is in the fin, or perhaps vanes to redirect the jet. So you just steer the airplane around by the fin, okay? No pivot. Now I have another arrow for Mach 2. Now I should have a third arrow there that says Mach 0. And you can guess which way that arrow points. It points right along the length of the wing. See? So you can have any number of them parked at the terminal facilities. The real reason the Navy likes the oblique-winged airplane is they can get more of them on the carrier. They fold the wing back. Anyway, when Boeing announced that it was going to increase the span of its 747 by 80 feet, the airport operators objected strenuously because they couldn't accommodate them. Well, you see, this has a span, namely chord, of only 50 feet. So you can get lots of them at the terminal. Well, there's a concept. It's hard to make it look like an airplane. Right? That's as close as you can come. Now this shows my estimate of the pounds of fuel per passenger versus range. Now you see the Concorde needs 2,000 pounds of fuel to cross the Atlantic. If everything goes well, it will land with 50,000 pounds. It needs 50,000 pounds to get to an alternate, okay? Because of the poor subsonic lift-drag ratio. But you see, if you remember the lift-drag ratios for the flying wing, does anybody know of an SST design that has lift-drag ratios as high as those over the flight range? I want someone to tell me what's wrong with this. No, nobody does. I know it doesn't look pretty, but anyway. Well, of course, we cannot compete with a 747 flying at Mach 2. I don't think there's any way to do that. But we can do a lot better than Concorde. See? Now, in the subsonic range, you have an L over D of at least 20. If you straighten the wing out completely, you have 30. Okay? And that seems to me the picture. With the flying wing, we can make a supersonic transport that will cross the Pacific, okay? Which is where you really need the supersonic transport, I think. Now, I should say something about the engine requirement. Am I running out of time? What?
Lots of time.
Lots of time. Well, see, if you have an aircraft configuration that shows flexibility, that has a high lift-drag ratio at low speed and also at high speed, then you ought to have similar flexibility in the engine. For example, the engines of the Concorde are very efficient at Mach 2. The conversion efficiency is 40%. Okay? But being pure jets, when they slow down to Mach 2/10, their efficiency drops to about 1/10 of that. And that is partly responsible for the large fuel requirement at low speed. Right? So what you want is a fan jet at low altitudes and low speeds where you have a large slipstream, okay, good propulsive efficiency. At high altitude and high speed, you don't need the large slipstream, okay? But since the air density is an order of magnitude less than at sea level, you need to swallow much more air. You need a higher compression ratio, okay? So at high altitude and high speed, you ought to put the fan in series with the compressor, okay? Low altitude and low speed, you bypass most of the part of the compressor. In the first few stages, then you make into a fan. So you have a fan jet. There's been some work on this, but there doesn't seem to be as much as there should be. Okay? A variable cycle or variable bypass engine is what you really need for this. Okay? If you had just a pure jet, then the efficiency of the SST would be no better at Mach 1, in spite of the fact that I can get it, let's see, at Mach 1 I can get an L over D of 20. Okay? At Mach 2 the L over D drops to 10. But the efficiency of the pure jet engine doubles between 1 and 2. Okay? So in order to improve the efficiency along with the lift-drag ratio, then you need, or you should have, a variable bypass engine. Okay? I think that's something that deserves a lot more work than it's received. Okay? Now, some of you might be afraid to fly in an all-wing airplane. That is, an airplane that doesn't have a tail. So in order to calm fears about that, I have these flying models. Okay. Now this is an all-wing airplane. Okay. No tail. It has a little nose weight out here to get correct balance, you see. And it has vertical surfaces which have steered the wing around to fly at 45 degrees. So here's an all-wing airplane that flies at 45 degrees. Now, heads up, I'll show you how it flies. It's perfectly stable. Stability is clearly no problem. I think some of you may have seen that airplane before. Well, that's all I had to say. I would like to answer questions. Now, it took a great deal of courage for the British and the French to build an SST, a supersonic transport. But unfortunately, it hasn't really worked out economically. I know that because I've never been supersonic myself. I can't afford to ride in the Concorde. I feel a little bit like Charlie Zimmerman. Many of you remember Charlie Zimmerman. He worked at Langley when I was there. Well, thank you, Jack. Can everyone hear me? Well, it's good to be back. In 1948, the National Academy of Sciences held its annual meeting in Berkeley, California. I was scheduled at that meeting to give a talk on possibilities for supersonic transport. Three other fellows were there on the speaking program. Shockley, Bardeen, Brattain, three young fellows from Bell Labs. I spoke on the supersonic transport. I thought that my theory of the swept wing with subsonic edges, perhaps the delta wing, could result in a viable supersonic transport. Shockley, Bardeen, and Brattain spoke on, they disclosed for the first time their invention of the transistor. Well, the transistor has changed the world, but the supersonic transport has not. And he was in charge of the spin tunnel. At that time, in the early 30s, the Army Air Corps had a problem with spinning. They'd lost a number of airplanes in the spin, so they sent a general to Langley Field to find out what progress we were making on the spin problem. Well, Dr. Lewis accompanied the general to Langley Field. He took him to Charlie Zimmerman. He introduced Zimmerman to the general as the world's foremost